So, a warm welcome to the monthly online guest lecture organized by research scholars at our School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, Goa University. Today, we are honored to host Dr. Susi Ferrarello, who will be delivering a talk on Giorgi and qualitative methods in phenomenology. Please note that this event, including the contents in the chat box, is being recorded. To ensure a smooth experience for all, I kindly request everyone to keep their microphones on mute throughout the lecture, which will last for approximately 60 minutes. Following the lecture, we'll have 30 minutes Q&A session. Now, to formally begin the session, I invite Sia to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Diksha. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. A very good evening to one and all. I'm pleased to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Susi Ferrarello. Dr. Ferrarello is an associate professor of philosophy at California State University, East Bay. She has authored numerous books, including The Ethics of Love, Phenomenology of Pregnancy and Early Motherhood, and Human Emotions and the Origin of Bioethics. Additionally, she co-edited volumes like Empathy and Ethics, The Handbook of Phenomenology and Mindfulness, and The Vulnerability of the Human World, and the forthcoming Handbook of the Phenomenological Bioethics. Beyond her academic work, Dr. Ferrarello is a philosophical counselor and an active voice in public philosophy, writing for platforms such as Psychology Today. She also leads public facing initiatives like the podcast Philosophy Gets Personal and the project No Bump, No Care, which advocates for women needing perinatal care. I also take this opportunity to welcome the Dean of the School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, Dr. Koshi Tharakan, all other faculty members at Goa University, all research scholars and students from Goa University, and all participants, that is, faculty, students, and others from and outside the university. I welcome you all. Over to you, Diksha.
Yes, Dr. Susi, you may continue with your presentation.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for this warm invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And thank you all for attending. I know it's late, so thanks for hanging on with me. Let's talk about how we can use phenomenology in our practical experience and especially in our research. So today, the goal of this meeting, of this presentation, would be twofold. From one hand, I would like to show how phenomenology can help us to read through experience, through fine grains, and to see the components of the experience in perspectives that maybe we miss when we live, when we actually experience life. And the second goal is to see how Giorgi's method can help us to see the patterns of the same experience. So clearly, each one of us has different experiences. Each one of us tends to go through life in different ways. Nevertheless, when we use psychology, when we use qualitative methods, the goal is to try to see the patterns um, that are in common through different experiences from different people, although we examine the same lived experience. So how it is to love, how it is to experience an heartbreak, how it is to go through a loss. And I hope this talk will be able to inspire many of your super interesting researches. I had the honor to read PhD dissertations, researches that used Giorgi's method, and it was mind-blowing. The directions that Giorgi's method and in general qualitative phenomenology can lead to. Now, let's say a word about phenomenology. Every time we use the word phenomenology, we need to be aware of how general, after all, this word is, and how many phenomenologies, in fact, we have. Originally, the word was coined in the 18th century. It was Lambert who used the term phenomenology to indicate the doctrine of appearance of living phenomena. So, with phenomenology, we really want to be able to study the experience as it starts appearing to us. The word phainomai in Greek means to appear, to manifest. So it's really the desire to catch the experience as it starts showing to us in its meaning, of course. And then this word became famous with Hegel mostly, a little bit with Kant, Peirce, who used the phenomenological method in a way that was deeply philosophical, trying, for example, for Hegel, to see how we become who we are, the spirit, the unhappy individual that becomes through different phases, the consciousness, the whole being able to be aware of itself. So it was much later with Husserl, so we are at the beginning of the 19th century, sorry, at the beginning of the 20th century, last 18th century, that we start developing a new way of looking at phenomenology. Um, so phenomenology becomes, with Husserl, even more than with Hegel, a sort of a psychology, a sort of a transcendental psychology. There's still the desire to catch the experience, to be able to describe the experience, but in relation to the subject that is living that experience. And then, as it has been said, from Husserl on, phenomenology became the history of heresies, in the sense that after Husserl, his followers took phenomenology in so many directions that phenomenology started indicating something different according to the philosopher who used that. So here, in particular, in this presentation, I would like to compare how the phenomenological method would look different whether we talk about phenomenology in Husserl or phenomenology in Heidegger. On the one hand, we will have a transcendental descriptive approach. On the other hand, we would have an interpretive hermeneutic approach. So we are still talking about phenomenology, but the ways of looking at the experience are completely different. Still, will they both have a psychological goal, because we both want to understand how experience unfolds itself. And we need to be minded that when we adjust philosophy to psychology, we are going to lose something. So one critique that is often raised when you are at big conferences with specialists from different areas is that phenomenological psychology is not adherent enough to the philosophy of Husserl or Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty, that there are macro mistakes and so on. As Dorian Kern here that I cited says, yeah, it is true that Husserl's philosophy, for example, or Heidegger philosophy, seems to be simplified when we create a method, when we adjust it to a method. Nevertheless, this cannot discourage us from doing it, because the results we can get from applying this method onto the investigation of life are so good that it is worth it to sacrifice a little bit the refinement of the delicacy of certain theories to be able to use them in life as an actual science. So let's start looking at the methods. We have in the phenomenological tradition three main methods, or three main traditions that informs many methods actually, and many more are coming. It's actually difficult to keep up with the amount of methods that um, uh, phenomenology is producing for qualitative research, which is great, and we should keep going in this direction. So, one phenomenological approach is particularly influenced by the concept of the life world, that, as you know, it emerges during the crisis, or better, while Husserl was writing the crisis. So we are at the beginning of yeah, we are in 1936. The Second World War starts looming in the life of Husserl. He was a Jew, he was deported in a little ghetto. So the life world becomes a very powerful concept that almost immediately is adopted by sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists of his time. He was even forbidden to deliver this speech, but fortunately, they managed to read the letter where the speech was written at the conference. Uh, what is the life world about? The life world insists on the importance of the subject's life in the way in which we relate to the world. There's no chance that we can describe reality and the world outside of us without taking into consideration the subject object relationship we have with that world. So, when we describe the individual's way of living a certain reality, we have to take into consideration is the concept of selfhood, the sociality, embodiment, temporality, spatiality. Um, this became evident, for example, with the works of Ashworth, Dalberg, and many other philosophers who emphasized, for example, Toombs also in medicine, who emphasized the asymmetry that we might have within the same reality, within the same world when we describe the experience. So let's think of the relationship doctor-patient. If the patient is receiving a diagnosis, certainly those 5 minutes of diagnosis that will change the life of the patient will be very different from the 5 minutes that the doctor is experiencing. We are having the clash of two different life worlds, even if we are in the same little room with not even 1 meter of distance between two people. So this approach is certainly fascinating in going in depth in looking at the elements that might influence the way in which we experience reality. Then we have an approach that is post-intentional. And in this approach, basically, we treat the phenomenon as a unit of analysis. Um, for example, we want to examine what the experience of falling in love is. So the phenomenon of falling in love becomes our unit. But then we know that there are many other phenomena that will flow within this experience of falling in love, because when we fall in love, there's our ego that somehow is scared. There's the fear of not being loved back, the I don't know, the excitement of being and anxiety of anticipation of being with the other person. So we want to consider in this approach the simultaneity of the phenomena, the flow within the phenomenon we are analyzing. It's quite complex to handle, but certainly it has that dynamic quality that is part of the way in which we experience life. And then the interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is the main competitor, I'd say, to Giorgi's method that we will analyze today. Um, Jonathan Smith, but also now the school of oh, vabbè. Here, Fernandez Allan, see, here are the two main approaches we have to the application of the phenomenological method to a qualitative experience. And we mostly have the hermeneutic approach and the descriptive approach. Now, the hermeneutic interpretive is basically characterized by this. The researcher is part of the analysis. We cannot think that we are describing something without being involved in the description. So the researcher performs an active role in the interpretive process. We will come back to that and explain more why. Um, when we use the interpretive approach, we are mostly inspired by Heidegger and Gadamer. If we use instead the descriptive approach, we are mostly informed by Husserl's philosophy. Giorgi's method is mostly informed by Husserl's philosophy and Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. What's the difference between these two approaches? We already said something, now we go a little more in depth. So, Husserl's approach is mostly transcendental. What does that mean? When we use the word transcendental, we refer to our ability to reflect on what we are doing as a disinterested spectator. Often they compare the transcendental approach to a meditative approach because we sort of floatate above the phenomenon as if this phenomenon is not touching to us. It's not involving us into an important action. So we are capable of describing the phenomenon from above. And transcendental also is a very important place because it's also the condition of possibility for something to appear as is. When we look at a phenomenon from an above perspective, a neutral perspective, and we try to understand what it is, we look around the phenomenon to try to see all its aspects. So, for example, I don't know if you see what I'm holding in my hand, but if you look at this phenomenon from here, I mean, it could be a piece of cloth or I don't know, a piece of plastic. Then you will look at this from another angle, then from another angle, then you would see this and that, and slowly you would realize that okay, she's holding a phone in her hand. And the condition for a phone to be a phone is that it has a certain shape, it has a certain rigidity, it can make phone call and so on. This allows me to arrive at the conclusion that, okay, this is a phone. I can call this a phone. This is exactly what you do with the analysis of a certain lived experience. You choose to interview a certain amount of people, generally 7, 8, and then you start looking at their interviews, their analysis of their lived experience from different angles until you find all the aspects that are the constituents of that experience. So, for example, for falling in love, again, for the lived experience of falling in love, the constituent of that experience is experiencing elation, anxiety, wanting to see the person you are in love with as soon as possible after saying goodbye. These might be the constituents that make the meaning of falling in love something that we can recognize as falling in love. And in this, you are not participating in creating this meaning, you are just observing from an overall perspective. In that sense, Husserl's phenomenology believes that it can provide an approach that is scientific. What do we mean here by scientific? Not something that is always right, but is something that can be replicable, that can be applied over and over, producing similar results. So this method doesn't want to arrive to a relativization of the experience. So for me, researcher, the experience of falling in love is this, for another one could be another one. We want to arrive through this analysis to something that is as general as possible, as scientific as possible, in the sense of replicable as possible, something that can be accepted as true from the largest amount of people. And to do so, how do we do? What's the main source of this scientific foundation? The epoché and the reduction. What are they? Basically, they come from a Selbstbesinnung, which means a self-determination to say something, to vow to an ethical attitude that makes the researcher as small as possible. When we do phenomenological research using Giorgi's method, for example, we make the promise while we're doing the research to forget completely about our background. So if we are phenomenologists, if we are doctors, if we studied plenty of, I don't know, Kant's philosophy, we make the promise, we self-determine, Selbstbesinnung, our attitude to be as impersonal as possible. So epoché means parenthesis. We put in parenthesis all the trainings, all the background, all the knowledge we previously collected, in order to be able to assume this transcendental approach, in order to be able to look at the phenomenon from a transcendental perspective. Then, once we are in this perspective, remember, looking at the phone, but not knowing that it's a phone, well, the Apple actually gave it away. I didn't think about it. But anyway, when we look at something here and we have no idea of what that is, we want to apply the imaginative variation. So we try to project from what we see, from the perspective we can observe, all the possible images of that object that would allow me to guess its meaning. So in this case, I know that this is for, well, maybe just if I do this, you can understand that it's something to make holes in the paper. So these are the main steps that allow the application of a phenomenological method in qualitative research to be as descriptive, as objective, as general as possible. Now, if you look at the hermeneutics approach, so if you look at the approach as inspired by Heidegger, you will realize that you go in a direction that is completely different. not useless, I mean, just different. And it depends on what you want to study or what your goals are. Maybe one approach is better than the other. So, in Heidegger's approach, or better, in the approaches inspired by Heidegger, we are in the world. We are not neutral observers. We are thrown in the world, and we belong to the temporality of this life world. So we cannot forget the framework within our actions, our lives are taking part. The consciousness, the fragment of consciousness that we try to investigate with our method is part of the historical formation of what we are investigating. The nature of the analysis that will be part is way more interactive, way more dynamic, and more spontaneous. But at the same time, it's tied to the individual who is doing research. So the narratives, for example, that the descriptions, the interviews that we can gather from participants are narratives that are situated in that moment, in that dialogue with the interviewer. And the meaning making that will come after that interview is influencing the structure that we are going to use to interpret the world. So, for example, if we use Fernandez's method, which is becoming quite popular now, we will see how at the end of the study, we basically created a preliminary observation of how existentials influence that lived experience. So the existential is basically the feeling through which we live that lived experience. So, for example, depression could have a specific existential that is the sense of demeanor and sadness and heaviness that one might feel when experiencing that moment in life. So it is quite interesting as well, but as you can see, they are two very different way of approaching a lived experience. So on the one hand, we have ontological assumptions that say, in the case of Husserl's inspired method, reality is internal to the knower, and what appears in their consciousness is the only thing I can describe, while for the other approach, the lived experience is an interpretive process that can be explicated through the interaction with the observer. So on the one hand, the epistemological assumption we have is that the observer must separate himself or herself from what is experiencing in order to assume a transcendental perspective. In the other approach, the observer is part of the world and understand the world and the phenomenon that is unfolding in that world as an interpretive part of the relationship. So, on one approach, the researcher role is to bracket their own subjectivity during data collection and to be as neutral as possible. And again, one other important element is that we don't bracket ourselves once and for all. We do it once, or we do it well, and it's done. No, every time, every moment we look at the data, we bracket ourselves, because there's always the temptation to come back and to apply our way of looking at things. And learning epoche is extremely helpful, not only for qualitative research, but in life in general. When I was working, especially during the pandemic, with my clients, I taught them to apply the epoche, for example, over and over to reach a sense of serenity and to not assume always the worst about what was happening around them. And that was a way to reach a place of serenity. Maybe it's too much, but a calmer position. In the other approach, the researcher reflects together with the participant experience with the phenomena. And this reflection brings back maybe themes about their own life. So it's a very active approach. And same thing while doing data analysis or writing, in the case of the transcendental approach, their role is to identify units of meanings, and we will see how, and to find the general pattern, and to have the Giorgi called it, Giorgi based on Husserl, eidetic seeing. So when the phenomenon finally shows itself to us and speaks to us, while for the hermeneutic approach, we have repeated cycles that try to capture in writing the parts of a certain lived experience, so that we can have the whole of an experience. But again, it's through different cycles of reflecting and writing. So here, clearly, I'm focusing more and more on the transcendental descriptive approach. I'm hinting at the interpretive because it's also useful to see the differences. But when we are in the transcendental descriptive tradition, we can encounter methods like those of Smith and Colaizzi, Mostaka, Van Manen. They, Giorgi, of course, they criticized each other because, of course, one method had more of one aspects than another, but in common they had anti-scientism, which means, we want to arrive at describing an experience as general as possible, as subjective, if you want, as possible, because we want to uh, we want to provide a type that is useful then in psychology, anthropology, psychiatry, to understand how that lived experience works. But at the same time, we don't want to believe that this result is a result once and for all. We don't want to fall into the idea that what science says is right just because science says it. And this is a problem that Husserl evidenced in his crisis. And unfortunately, we're still here in the crisis of the European sciences, the book I was referring to before when I was talking about the life world. Because he says that kind of science has created so many idealization, meaning big categories that are somewhat forgetful of the real life of the human beings, and even believes that the life of human beings is pointless and doesn't say anything respect to those categories. We don't want to believe in results that look scientific. We want to believe in a science in the traditional, if you want, a Greek-Roman term. So a presuppositionless science. What does that mean? It is a science that investigates its basis, its foundation over and over. So if we analyze the lived experience of love and we arrive at the general description and we publish our study and everything works very nicely, we know that this study is, of course, the beginning point of multiple other studies that can look at the foundation of what we manage to describe in different ways and maybe add other qualities, analysis, or maybe the experience of falling in love, as we can see with our technology, will change through life because now it's through app, it's through digital encounters. So clearly, the description of falling in love in 10 years ago is different from the description of now. So we want that science is um, is looking at itself and its own basis, its own foundation, and considering the life of people as an intentional flow. So we don't want to create, the objective category, since this is objective, is always right, is always true, and we cannot say a word through that because this is a system and it works. And on the other hand, there's a subject that tries to say, yeah, but when I fall in love, I do this or that. We want to create a flow. So the category that our description managed to bring to life is in an intentional, ongoing connection that informs each other. So the life of the individual is part of what we consider as objective, what we can bring to a certain level of generality. And then, of course, it might be investigated over and over according to the changes in a certain area. So now, here I present you two methods, which is Smith and Coletsi method and Giorgi's method. As you can see at first sight, they seem already somewhat similar. And generally, Coletti's method seems to be, to my experience with PhD students, seems to be the most competitive to those who like also Giorgi's method. Um, they have some points of continuity. So, for example, in this method, the first step after having collected interviews is to read and reread the original data. When they wrote, of course, interviews were collected in different ways and even transcriptions were different. So it was by talking and writing or even by phone. Now we have the technology of videos that might help, and even AI that can help to transcribe data. So is slightly different. But the principle is the same. You collect data and you analyze the original data. In this case, you have audio, you might have video. And then the second step, if you want, is the most time consuming because you start making notes about the interviews you read. And based on the notes you make, you can see the emergent themes that come up. And then the fourth step is to search for connection across the themes and creating a table of these themes. Um, then you want, and you leave the table there, and maybe you'll come back and you'll change the table again afterwards. Then you come back to your data and you repeat the same. The final goal, step 6, is to see this table one alongside the other and try to see the pattern that across the 9 participants, 7, generally we are around this amount because it's very time consuming. And then you might see how there's a pattern that starts emerging between these different data. Now, Giorgi's method, I think it's more how to describe it. it gives you less freedom in the sense that it guides you more through the steps, in the sense that the beginning is the same for everyone. So you collect and describe data. Again, collection can happen through any way, video, phone, one-to-one encounters, and you want to be able to collect as many data as possible, pauses or moments of lapse, something that it cannot be written, but you want to put down also the bodily language that might emerge there. And another important element in collecting this data is that you want to have a person who actually has something to say about that phenomenon. Sometimes I noticed with PhD students, for example, it might happen that they cannot find immediately participants, so maybe they force onto someone, friends or relatives, certain topics. And in that case, the data really will not bring you anywhere because there's no life in the data. So you really want to have someone who starts writing a lot or starts talking spontaneously without too much effort. Another important element in collecting this data is that you don't want to have an interview in the sense of the person just talk. You don't want to have leading questions. You don't want to interrupt. You present the research question, and then the person starts talking. An intervention which would be instead welcome in the other approach is not desirable in this approach because, again, the researcher is as invisible as possible. Step 2, still easy. You read the descriptions. So you have your set of data and you start reading them. Then the third step, and here is where I think that Giorgi's method is more guiding than Colaitz's method. You break this description into into meaning units. Uh, so this is a very time-consuming process because you have to read your interview and your descriptions and create units of sense that are such for you. So I don't know. I have always Russian difficult book around me. But anyway, here, for example, I read, meanwhile spring arrived. My old dejection passed away and gave place to the unrest which spring brings with it, full of dreams and vague hopes and desires. So this is how the page would read normally. I need to create the unit. So I would say, meanwhile spring arrived is a meaning unit. It can stand by itself, is understandable, and it clearly creates a room of meaning. My old dejection passed. Here, that would be another unit. Even if there's no comma, there's nothing that indicates the end, it seems a meaning unit. Gave place to the unrest, another meaning unit, which spring brings with it, full of dreams and vague hopes and desire. That I think would be another meaning unit. So this spring brings with it something that is the dreams, hopes, and desires. So basically, you read a text in a new way. You start making sense, making a meaning out of your sense, and you create many little units. And these units will become your delight and your nightmare, because then you will have to transform these units into an impersonal language. So you will want to transform the unit uh, in a language that is not necessarily yours, so you are not interpreting, you are not leaving the language of the person who is using it, but you are doing imaginative variation, basically. Do you remember when I showed you this thing and we were trying to look at it from different perspective and we were trying to see, okay, what does this thing do? Basically, this is the same you do, but with a text. To do the imaginative variation, to look at the text from different perspective, but working with the text and not with the visual object, you start transforming the words. So I hope I find the same page. Of course not. Yeah. Meanwhile, spring arrived. It could be at some point a better season came. My old ejection passed away. So what I used to experience before as a heavy and but here I would need more time. Clearly, it's a Russian novel, so it's hard to be loyal from for a delicate book as this. But I will try to find different words to describe the same meaning. And this would allow me to look at this phenomenon from different perspectives. And I don't do it just once. I might do these transforming meaning units multiple times because my goal is, again, to look at this phenomenon from different perspectives. And that is extremely time consuming, but it gives an incredible satisfaction and great results when you do step 5, the eidetic seeing. So you compare together these units that you transform, and here we come back to something that is more similar to Colaizzi. You compare these units together, and the phenomenon, the structure of this phenomenon comes out. And you see, okay, so for the experience of falling in love to be an experience of falling in love, to be recognized as such, there must be this and that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to recognize it as such. And on step 6, you integrate all the features that you learned that are essential for this phenomenon into the structure of the phenomenon. And this is the most rewarding moment because as I experienced it from working with different students, what you assumed at the beginning rarely matches the results. And this is generally the proof of a successful research. So the assumptions at the beginning, so fall in love is all about love and just that. No, when you arrive at the results, you realize the depth of the meaning of love, and then maybe you realize a sense of fear, of anxiety, of disintegration of the ego that is part of the love experience. And it becomes part of this phenomenon that you wanted to analyze, but at the beginning it was providing just 2 or 3 words that were shallow and limiting. And then when you arrive at the end of this route, it will bring you a structure that is the haha moment. So, wow, this makes sense, but you didn't anticipate it at all. Now, we don't have much time. I would like just to spend a few words before concluding on the importance of the difference between description and interpretation, because one of the main objections that has been raised against Giorgi's method is that, yeah, but this, after all, is an interpretation, it's not a description. Yes, of course, whatever we say, once we say it, is an interpretation of reality, because reality speaks in a language that is not our own, that is not replicable, because we don't know in itself what a tree says, or what my body is actually experiencing when I'm doing something. So yeah, life is very much about interpretation, creating narratives, and so on. Yet, we cannot say that Giorgi's descriptions are interpretations, because there's a methodological stance that Giorgi's take that is mostly transcendental. And here I'm quoting this article that is particularly helpful. So Husserl took from Mohanty, Sebom, Carr, Sokolowski, Welton interpretation of Husserl's phenomenology, in which it shows that the way in which reality gives itself to us, remember the beginning when we were describing phenomenology as this reality that unfolds to us as phenomena that we want to interpret. So, uh, according to the transcendental description, tradition, this interpretation of phenomena happens as an encounter between subject and object, and the subject brackets its own subjectivity and tries to reduce its own perspective and here reduction does not mean to make it smaller, but it means from Latin reducere, to bring it back to a perspective that is as impersonal, as general as possible. So, as I was showing at the beginning, the researcher, the observer, is not involved, or at least it promises to not be involved in the analysis of the phenomenon. And in fact, the participants are interviewed with just the research question. The meaning of the interviews are bracketed, and their words are transformed into different meanings, into different units. So the meaning making in the interpretation, in the interpretive approach, would involve the subject, would involve the way in which, in the tradition, the subjects of research interpreted the problem. In a descriptive approach, we have a method that tries to clarify, to use imaginative variation, to use different points of view to understand what the meaning unit is telling to us. And it's a different methodological approach. In this case, we want to use epoche, reduction, imaginative variation to describe the essence of a certain phenomenon, which means we promise ourselves to make our presence as uninfluencing as possible on the phenomenon. So if you want to use as Giorgi did Spigelsberg's words, the description is a cooperative encounter. It's an intersubjective encounter where subject and object meet in a third place, in a third space that is shared and produces a certain result. So in this case, Giorgi's approach is Husserlian because, as he says, it employs a description. The phenomenological reduction of the researcher is an attitude that is kept throughout the whole research, and the goal is to show, to arrive at describing invariant meanings. We want to describe the essence, we want to describe the objective structure of the phenomenon as invariant, because invariant is the way in which reality appears to us as this thing. I can take it from my desk as many times as I want, and it will look always the same, because reality is the same, then the way in which it appears to me might be different according to the angle, the light, the way in which I look at it. But there's an invariant structure. And the phenomenologist will try to look at its essence and to say, okay, for this phenomenon to be described as a hole piercer, it must do this, this, and that. It must be like this and that. So that is the main difference between the phenomenological, interpretive, and descriptive approaches. Now, yeah, we will skip all this. Clearly, I was optimistic in my speed of talk. So here I'd like to share with you the most relevant works if you want to approach Giorgi's method. The book in 1970 is a must. I don't know if it's easy to find. It has been republished. There's the humanistic phenomenological psychology approach that is still very much connected to Giorgi's work. And here the general bibliography I use for these presentations. So thank you so much. If you have questions, here is my email, and thanks again for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Susi, for that insightful talk. We now move to the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Bhavna. Over to you, Bhavna.
Yeah, thank you, Diksha. So before we move forward with the Q&A session, I would like to inform the participants that they either can type their questions in the chat box or can use a raise hand option by clicking at the bottom button of their screens by unmuting themselves. Now the floor is open for questions and discussion.
Okay, may I?
Of course.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Susi, for this wonderful talk.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Firstly, when you at the last you make a defense of Giorgi that it involves Husserlian rather than interpretive phenomenology. I have certain reservations. Though we use eidetic method, to reach at the essences. So in that sense, you are reading it Husserlian, but I think ultimately one cannot avoid the very interpretation of transcripts. Though transcripts are objectively recorded, that's fine. But when someone embarks on interpreting those transcripts, his the interpreter's background inevitably comes into existence. I mean, so 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 how can we avoid that background of the interpreter himself? So how would you respond to it?
It's there. It's absolutely there. You would be a Buddha to be able to be just, a meditative floating subject looking at
Yeah.
life. So absolutely, yeah. The background is going to be there. It will remain there. But there's the Selbstbesinnung. There's this promise that you make and you made during research that says, I will try to keep my background as uninfluenced,
Minimal.
as
Minimal.
possible.
Yeah. But even if you keep it minimal, it is still there.
Can I finish?
Yes, please, please.
Of course. Okay. Imagine that you are a psychoanalyst and you use the interpretive approach or the descriptive approach. If you're using the interpretive approach, you will say, ah, fantastic. Now I'm going to use Freud to analyze this problem because I think that here Freud has something to say for the lack of words that this person is experiencing. And you can do it in interpretive approach. If you're using a descriptive approach, you'll say, oh God, this here would be perfect to use Freud because this is clearly a lapsus and it can lead here, here and there. But then you bite your tongue and you would say, okay, I cannot bring in Freud here. I will just keep going in reading the description and try to transform the units. Will you stop being a psychoanalyst? Never. I mean, this will cross your mind, you will try, maybe you will, in the end, even if you don't want to, use a little bit of Freud in the way in which you are transforming the units. Nevertheless, you are not bringing in full power Freud to explain that point. Can you see? Clearly, you're right. I mean, that's why I brought it in, because this is one of the most common critiques we move to the method. The assumptions of the methods, of the two methods, are different. And in the way in which we apply these methods, we use different approaches.
There's one more question.
Right.
Yeah, so when we say Husserlian transcendental phenomenology, then he not only remains confined to eidetic method of finding essences, as you described, he also goes to realm of pure ideas, which are like the ideas of mathematics and logic, which are severed from the experiences. And he makes elaborate criticism of naturalism. So in that way, if we follow strictly Husserlian transcendental phenomenology, it is anti-naturalistic. It moves us away from our natural experiences. So in that sense, I don't really see Husserl, at least in this avatar, to be really useful for, I mean, something which is experiential, which is some patient suffering from some depression or any psychological condition. So how can we respond to it?
Okay, so here we are in different areas. Giorgi is inspired by Husserl. So if I have to present Giorgi's method, I would say that is inspired by Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, and that's a fact.
Yeah.
But then you say, but this spoils a little bit the method for me, because if it's influenced by Husserl, then it creates something that is detached from experience. But then if you look at a philosophy of arithmetics, which is one of his first books, I mean, it's true, Stumpf criticized him, but it was one. And it was somewhat his master, which often happens that there are moments of criticism. When you look at the way in which he explains the number, he doesn't explain it as detached from experience, rather the opposite. I mean, the concept of manifold and the collection of percepta that brings to the predicative experience of saying one is one is deeply connected to the intentional flow of subject and object. So even in his way of explaining the origin of mathematics is deeply embedded in the lived experience, so much so that Weierstrass was telling him, you are a terrible mathematician, you would do better to go into another field, in this case philosophy, because you cannot think completely in abstractions here. So as an Husserlian, I don't see him going in a direction that is too detached from experience, rather the opposite, even in his mathematical work.
But I think he does talk about aspatial, atemporal, absolute ideas which are severed from
Yeah.
experiences. Yeah.
And here we start, and here it becomes an Husserlian lecture. The atemporal is something that we reach through the transcendental, which means that we start from life, we start from the experience, and we try to parenthesize as much as possible our sense of time. So I'm talking about the atemporal, meaning the phenomenological sense of time, while I'm looking at my sense of time. In this sense of time, I parenthesize this unit of time and I realize, this unit of time is made of a precise structure. Any moment tries to bring me forward what I'm going to expect, pretensions, and holds something back of what I just passed. So I can describe this moment of time as absolute, meaning absolutus, meaning detached from what I'm living now, according to this structure that brings forward something and retains something. But that happens not because it's out there. Husserl strongly criticizes this way of looking at reality. It always starts from an analysis of the intentional lived experience. An intentional lived experience is the flow of consciousness as it locates in the life world.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, next we can see Professor Koshi has raised his hand. Yes, sir. Please, you can ask your question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Susi. It was a very insightful lecture. I mean, my response was and partly answered by your response to Dr. Navneet. Basically, I just wanted to say that Husserlian phenomenology one need to understand as a kind of, philosophical project which rejects both logicism and psychologism. I mean, this is very clear in the idea of phenomenology. To that extent, I agree with Dr. Ferrarello that our experience starts from this, world. It's not that with transcendental reduction, we have cut off completely from experiences. Rather, Husserl in Ideas 1 very clearly states, we have not lost anything, rather we have gained the whole world. But not the way in which naturalism understands. Rather, the whole world as correlated with my consciousness. So that's very important to keep in mind. It was just a remark. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks. So that's another very good way to take it. Yeah, philosophy as a rigorous science. It's all about his rejection of historicism, psychologism. And it's really beautiful because in reading his rejection, for example, for psychologism, you can gain new points of view to, for example, look at mental health. Because it really helps you to look at the phenomenon from the lived experience of the subject, but from a point of view that is general. And that can help to review certain diagnoses that are dismissive of subjective points of view.
Yes, moving on to another question. We can see that I think Govard sir has raised his hand. Yes, sir. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ferrarello. I'm Dutch American from Chicago. I studied phenomenology there at NIU with Dr. Theodore Thiel, who is a great Heidegger and Husserl expert. And since I've studied with him, I've always tried to figure out the relationship between these two of the greatest of the phenomenologists. And I learned a lot from Thiel himself because he's one of the things. So if you're really interested, he translated, and I have it here, and I can show it to you guys.
Yeah.
The history of the concept of time. Yeah. This was just the book or the text that Heidegger gave as a lecture before he wrote Being and Time. And in it is the most sustained discussion of Husserl. And basically, he's saying there are two great breakthroughs in Husserl. One is intentionality, and the other is categorical intuition. And categorical intuition, since I've studied with Gizil, has been one of my pet peeves there. How do we structure experience, and how do we then name it? Or how does the naming structure the experience? So that kind of dialect between the form of experience and the words that we're using. I think there are a lot of ways where they are so connected that their differences, for me, at a certain moment, kind of fall away. That's why I can say, like, okay, Husserl, he's more theoretical. He's maybe more applicable for scientific endeavors because of his position. And so I would say, yes, if you're into psychology, study Husserl. Heidegger, and this is the way that I'm interested in him, he's a transformative philosopher. He is about, getting you through kind of a change. I'm studying here in India, Krishnamurti. He is in the same way a transformative philosopher. He wants you to get so close to yourself, such an intense self-knowledge, that something will break, something will change, something will get transformed. And that seems for me the focus of Heidegger. But they got so much in common. And Heidegger had influence on Husserl, like the whole concept of the life world. You can very much, compare with the being in the world or worldhood. And let me make that into a question. Husserl makes the differentiation between static, genetic, and generative phenomenology. The static one would be something like act psychology. Look at the act of, remembering something. Keep it very simple. You can do it very scientifically. That's an act. The genetic thing is like, how do acts, pile upon each other? So my parallel is then with developmental psychology. How does a child, build up his skills that, for example, he acquires language? Now, the last one is, I think, where Heidegger comes in again, that generative phenomenology, and that is, how did we get here psychologically, philosophically, scientifically, culturally, taking into account, the big background of the past of philosophy, the past of science, the past of this, that, and the other, the past of language. And there, again, I think generative phenomenology is what actually Heidegger is doing. So these are just only a few of the ways where I'm playing around with trying to combine them. Also, Gizil said, this is the last thing that I'll say, Heidegger hid some of the methodology that he learned from Husserl, especially from reading the logical investigations, and did not properly refer back from where he, got his tricks. So anyway, so the question is, could you see Heidegger just being, let's say, a subset of Husserl's phenomenology being generative phenomenology? This the whole historicality and the deep background. Simple question. I'm not looking for it.
Thank you. Thanks. The premises were very rich. The question is, well, it's still difficult actually as a question. Because, concerning the relationship between Husserl and Heidegger, many books should be written, and, they have been written. I'm mostly uncertain, as you can tell probably from my presentation. Of course, I use Heidegger in certain things, but my scholarship is mostly in Husserl. And I think it's very important to know just a tiny bit about the which is difficult because if you are not into Husserl, why should you? About the editorial history of Husserl's works. Because Husserl was, I'm sorry, Husserl, but a horrible writer, very chaotic. He was so interested in experience that he published logical investigations because he needed to get this professorship. And yeah, the crisis, but that was posthumous, something about logicism. So, I mean, when poor man, when he was deported, and all his work were savaged by Van Breda, they found 10,000 pages written, 10,000 that weren't published. And I'm sorry, but Merleau-Ponty is the only scholar who was honest and loyal toward the sources. Because what happened? It happened that we had only logical investigations mostly. And so people started, and a little bit of crisis and the Cartesian meditation published at the beginning. So we took Husserl as a logical, very heady, cognitive philosopher, right? And flow of ink were spent on that. But then people working at the archives started doing the terrible job of editing these books, because we didn't even have books. He was writing with a specific system, so he was not completing even the words. Every word was, shortened and then written. So the people at the archives did an incredible slow work of editing books. And if you think that they are still publishing Husserlian books in German today, this gives you the sense of how little Husserl was known in the 60s, 70s, when this idea of the cognitive, logical Husserl was out. So what happened? That when we started reading the manuscripts, we discovered that many of the concepts that we find in Merleau-Ponty, in Levinas, in Heidegger, in, I don't know, you pick him, were already in Husserl. For example, the life world, the Dasein, Zeitungssein. And for me personally, as a Husserl scholar who read the manuscripts and did the job of not editing because I don't have the skills, but going there to read the manuscripts because I was particularly interested in his ethics, when I discovered that all these concepts were already there. And I'm sorry, but Heidegger called Husserl not a philosopher. And he said, okay, this doesn't deserve the teaching because this guy can barely do philosophy. So when considering the differences between Husserl and Heidegger, I find myself in a very difficult spot because many of the concepts we find in Heidegger were already there in Husserl. Nevertheless, certainly Heidegger emphasizes more the concept of the thrownness. He leaves aside the intentionality, which is instead something that keeps being in Husserl. So, yeah, there certainly is a generative aspect in Heidegger's work, but when we think of how Husserl was doing his lectures, his goal was to create a unique lived experience for his students. Not his goal. The lived experience, the analysis of the lived experience was first. He was a scientist in this. So there was a strong transformative aspect in the way in which, they were for Lesungen, yes. So that theoretically they were reading a script. Husserl would start reading the script and then move on toward the lived experience because he couldn't stay on that prepared manuscript. So I don't know, it's hard. I would see both of them as generative, as transformative. Certainly, if I can see another difference between Heidegger and Husserl, Heidegger was smarter in opening two different branches. I mean, he didn't keep philosophy in the ivory tower. He was in dialogue with architecture, with technology. Well, Husserl also in technology, but in a different way, with psychology. So that was certainly something that opened phenomenology to so many areas as we have today. If it were only for Husserl, maybe we wouldn't have that. We would have had phenomenology and psychology, and that's all. Sorry, it was a long answer, but the question was...
No, thank you. Yeah, it's just fascinating. It's just... Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, so moving on, I saw Dr. Devasya Antony raise his hand some time back. Sir, do you want to ask your question now?
My question was on Heidegger, which was raised by Professor Shula, so I don't want to repeat them again. Since in the answer to that question on Heidegger, Professor Susi said about Merleau-Ponty something that, according to Professor Susi, Merleau-Ponty is the only one who is faithful to Husserlian philosophical tradition. But if I understand you rightly, Professor, Merleau-Ponty critiques, like Heidegger, the eidetic reduction, the epoche of Husserl, doesn't follow that. At least it comes very faithfully, very forcefully in his unfinished manuscript, The Visible and the Invisible, where he speaks about hyperdialectic as a philosophical method, which he would follow. So when you say he's faithful to Husserl, I like to...
Sorry, here I need to interrupt you. Sorry, I don't say that he's faithful in the sense that he follows Husserl's tradition to the point, because otherwise he wouldn't be Merleau-Ponty. I'm saying that he acknowledges the sources. So he recognizes that, for example, the concept of Leib and Körper can be found in the manuscripts in that sense. It's much more circumscribed, yeah.
But I was just thinking the Merleau-Pontian unique idea of phenomenology as hyperdialectic, does it have some background in Husserlian manuscripts?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Merleau-Ponty's unique interpretation of phenomenology as a hyperdialectic, as a philosophical method. Does it have any mooring on Husserl's writings? Since I've read both, I suppose you'll be able to tell me something about that.
So you're saying that Merleau-Ponty, I agree with you that Merleau-Ponty is certainly unique, and he leads on the phenomenological tradition in a way that is original. You are asking me what's the relationship between Merleau-Ponty and Husserl's manuscripts and readings?
Yeah, in a sense, yeah.
Because you think that Merleau-Ponty didn't rely much on Husserl, is that the point?
No, I think he has in his intellectual vision Husserlian manuscript, as you rightly said, but he goes ahead. Especially his revisioning of phenomenology as a hyperdialectic, the intertwining, the chiasm, especially his interpretation of the French word le chair, the flesh. I think this is something unique to him, and he goes beyond Husserl. So I thought, since you have read Husserlian archives, I suppose, very closely, Does this reflect in any way Husserlian manuscripts?
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't have much more to say. I mean, I agree. He read Husserl, and he took what he needed, and he went beyond. I mean, the notion of schema, of schema, it's quite unique. Embodiment. I mean, we can find some idea of embodiment in Husserl as well. But again, Merleau-Ponty is unique, and the originality with which he applied certain phenomenological notion to psychology is just brilliant. I mean, it's yeah, like Levinas. I mean, there are. While with Heidegger, I see an overlapping that is much stronger at times. With other phenomenologists, I see how they got inspired. And in Merleau-Ponty, I appreciate the fact that he acknowledges the source of inspiration, but then they took it in different places beyond, as you said. Yeah, it's it becomes the philosopher. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I can see Diksha has raised her hand. Diksha, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Susi, for that talk. Now, my question is related to Giorgi's method. So, Giorgi's method, with its focus on finding universal psychological structures, is well suited for fundamental human experiences. However, when applied to socially or politically charged issues like colonialism or race or gender oppression, its reliance on bracketing may risk depoliticizing the lived experiences. So, to what extent can Giorgi's approach accommodate this sort of? As in, does its commitment to description inherently limit its capacity for social critique, or can it be adapted to engage it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't think much about that, unfortunately. Because, it's a scaffolded experience. I never encountered scholars, students who might want to do. Can we mute the microphone, please? Thank you. Who might want to do the phenomenological study and then in the same research do the critique and the analysis. I don't know, like the problem of gender with, as it has been done recently in phenomenology. It requires for just one book too much work, but it can be used. I mean, you can create a general description and then use this general description in a certain field. But as far as I read Giorgi, it wasn't there. I mean, there wasn't the political, sociological, anthropological, but then, as it often happens, it might be used in these directions. Yeah, feminism, maternity. I mean, it's. I know that it has been used in different areas, but as always, as a second step. I mean, first the study and then the application.
So I have a follow-up question to that, as in, if so that will entail as in integrating multiple phenomenological approaches. So as in, we can have the descriptive approach in describing, and then maybe use the interpretative approach to interpret according to whatever theme we are concerned with. So does such integration, so as in the question as in to what extent should a researcher commit to a single phenomenological methodology throughout a study, and will the coherence be compromised if these multiple approaches are brought into integration?
Well, it's curious because, yeah, you can do that. You cannot do the other way around. You, you cannot use the interpretive approach and then the descriptive approach, because the descriptive approach will tell you, forget about the interpretive approach. You have to keep going into just the text, just the units of meanings that you see. But yeah, you can start with a descriptive approach, do your publication, consolidate your results, and then use the results for an interpretive approach, which could be very interesting, because then the interpretive approach will place you more in the life world, because as you saw, in the interpretive approach, you are part of the life world, and there's you are a mechanism that makes change in this life world. So the interpretive meanings and narratives that you create can be looked at according to the perspective you need, whether it might be, feminism, queer theory, and so on. The descriptive approach is very much based on the interviews you receive. So it wouldn't compromise the results of the research if you use multiple approaches, but in the right order. Let's put it in this way.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I think we can see a few questions we have in chat box. There's a question by Ayush Kataria. He's asking, could you please elaborate more on philosophical counseling?
Yeah, with pleasure. So philosophical counseling is an activity I discovered in my late 20s. I did the training with Lou Marinoff. Probably you heard of him. He's a professor, and he became famous because he wrote Plato, not Prozac. And the book was, the title was funny, but it was quite, the message is powerful, meaning we can avoid to rely on a heavily medicalized approach to our mental health, to our emotional life, by looking at a phenomenon, by just think through it. As a philosopher, if we can read Kant and understand what he says, most probably we can understand what the common person can think when sitting in our office, and we can unfold, the complexity of their thoughts and maybe bring some clarity. So we don't need to quiet things down with medications always. We have philosophers, people who have been trained for years to understand complex thoughts, and to to see the structure of these thoughts in their essence, in their simplicity, in their in a structure. And we can help other people to reorient themselves. Of course, we cannot work with the people affected by, severe disorders like schizophrenia or depression, because, as he describes that, philosophical counseling is the psychology or the psychotherapy for the common person, for, if you want, the average healthy person. And so, I started in my 20s thinking, okay, nobody will ever come. This is something I'm doing just for myself because I'm curious about it. And instead, it became a side activity for me. I noticed that there is a growing number of people who is tired of being pathologized, medicalized, and yeah, they might go through moments of ethical confusion or emotional uncertainty, and they need someone who can bring some clarity on their way of looking at things, so they can receive the big picture of the situation they are in. And philosophers are generally good at it. So it was really, really fun. I mean, now the project I'm working at, No Bump, No Care, which is a nonprofit that works on perinatal care, is basically a network of philosophical counselors and other professionals who want to listen to women who are experiencing, women mostly, of course, also men if they need it, who are going through maternity and are experiencing, different problems. And generally, we tend to see maternity like, you are living depression. There are really little categories that we see in such a complex moment of a woman's life, and is often just medicalized. So it's depression, is delusions, and so on. While sometimes, you just need someone who looks at the situation as in a practical way and find the structure of the problem. Anyway, yeah, I hope I answered the question. No, they are still doing counseling. They are still doing trainings if you want online. I put the name.
Actually, some of us are doing the course now with Dr. Bala, with the PPAI, Philosophical Practitioners Association India. That's going
Bello.
on now.
Ah,
Yeah, that's now Saturday evening and Sunday evening for 10 weeks.
I didn't know. That's beautiful. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah. And it's with the American Association. So I
Ah,
think Rick Repetti is involved, and I don't know, someone else. But it's
I'm
good. It's very nice.
I mean, it's expanding, which makes me think, well, but who knows? In the network, I have a professional from Delhi, Sakshi Neji. So apparently, I mean, it's expanding across the world. I think we are fit for that. And
Yeah.
it's wonderful when I see clients actually benefiting from it, especially during the pandemic. It was incredible. I'm glad.
No, I see that it's the transition from Greek philosophy to Roman philosophy. The Greeks being more theoretical, the Romans getting a little more practical.
Well, the Romans are always more practical. It's always like that. I use lots of phenomenology, of course, with my clients. They don't know it,
Mm,
but I use lots
mm,
of phenomenology.
mm, mm.
Yeah. Yeah, if you need to ask any questions, I'll be happy to answer
Yeah.
in my
Can,
email.
can you share the bibliography that you had at the end? Because there are a
Sure,
lot of sources that I'm not familiar with.
absolutely. I will send it to Diksha, and she might circulate. Or if you want to, you can just email me, and I'll share it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I noted your. By the way, we're kind of a little full maybe already, but tomorrow I'm starting a reading group on phenomenology. We start with Kizil's 6-page do-it-yourself phenomenology. I'll send it to you.
Okay.
I'll send it also to Diksha to share. It's a absolutely wonderful, compact,
I didn't know it.
yeah, mostly Husserlian way for doing phenomenology, and he has how do you call that? An example about the experience of boredom. The phenomenology
That's
of
good.
boredom.
Yeah, I
And
had a
actually, when you were
colleague.
talking about phenomenology of love, in his class, we did a class project, and 10 of us had to do together the phenomenology of infatuation.
See, that's
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. And that was fantastic. that was really good.
It's a fun phenomenon to explore.
Yeah. And then we're
Yes,
going to read
please.
Sokolovsky's Introduction to Phenomenology, which I
Yeah,
recommend everybody
that's a must.
to get into. Yeah.
If possible,
Anyway,
please
if
share the
anybody's
link, Mr. Goa.
interested, I'll put my email address in here.
I saw that there
Because,
was an overlap of people talking and raising hands.
sorry, I'll shut up.
I'll save the email.
And Mr. Schuler,
Yes, sir.
yeah, can you please give some explanation for Husserlian feminism? I would be
Well, if you start with the experience of being a woman, you can do first the epoche, that the right kind of things that are not relevant for the experience. For example, you don't bring in hormonal explanations for let's say the difference between the behavior of men and women. That's out. So you have to be careful of what you bracket and what you keep. And then, you're going to have a phenomenology of what does it mean to be a man of course, it is contextualized. I lived in Europe, I lived in the US, I lived in India. So I got a lot of, let's say, variations that I can play with. And then indeed the application of imaginative variation. But you apply it on your own specific life world. So a lot of women, and I think because Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir were trained in Husserlian phenomenology, that I think a lot of what Simone de Beauvoir had to say, there is a Husserlian methodological background. So if you start with the right kind of experiences and you come to it with sensitivity of language, you can do a Husserlian feminism.
okay. Thanks.
But I will check it now with Dr. Ferrarello if that is okay.
Oh yeah, that was really nice way to explain it. I mean, if you need names, of course, there's Simone de Beauvoir. These were Marion Jung and Rieger Rai were the pioneers. And if you read the manuscripts which are now published, Husserl spoke at length about birth and even the relationship between the mother and the fetus and the mother and the baby. And it's quite interesting to see how modern his way of describing the phenomenon was, because while we were after all, after the Victorian age, when he was writing, and there was a way of describing the relationship with the baby as, okay, the baby has to have its space, it's in the world, and it's something else. We start seeing something that is somewhat close to Merleau-Ponty's idea of schema. Because it shows the germinal intersubjective relationship that is embodied between fetuses and mother. But anyway, it's it's a long description, and I discussed that in my recent book on phenomenology of pregnancy and early motherhood. But yeah, yeah, phenomenology, Husserl's phenomenology gives the opportunity to look at the phenomenon, not just the example you were giving was perfect. Yeah, the mother is sad because it's hormonal and it's been through these changes. Yes, but what is inside this organic moment? What meanings does that bring, and how does it reflect in the intersubjective relationship of the family and so on? Yeah.
Yeah, do we have any more questions? So, since we are running out of time, I would like to inform the participants that if any of their questions have been not answered, they can correspond with Dr. Susi through her email. Her email address is mentioned in the chat box. Thank you for your questions. Now, I would like to call upon Diksha to finally.
Yeah, thank you, Bhavna, for moderating the Q&A session. Now, to formally conclude the event, I now invite Jonathan to propose the vote of thanks.
On behalf of the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, Goa University, I would like to thank Dr. Ferrarello for an incredible lecture on Giorgi and the qualitative methods in phenomenology. Thank you for guiding us through the diverse phenomenological methods employed in qualitative research in the human sciences, such as the descriptive phenomenological method in psychology. I would like to thank our Dean, Professor Koshi Tarakan of the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, our faculty members of the school, and all research scholars at Goa University, as well as participants from other schools beyond Goa University. I'd also like to thank those who helped in designing the wonderful poster and publicizing this event. With this, we end this wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Doctor.
you,
It was wonderful. Thank you. Very inspiring.
As we conclude,
Thank-
sincere thank you to Dr. Susi for her insightful lecture and all the attendees for their engagement. Before we sign off, a quick reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on our YouTube channel, Philosophy at Goa University. Do subscribe to stay updated. We look forward to welcoming you again for our next online guest lecture. Until then, stay well and keep learning. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Diksha.